Always trust.
We ask the questions.
What is needed in the world?
James Graham Wilson, historian at the U.S. Department of State and author of America's Cold Warrior, Paula Nitzea, and National Security from Roosevelt to Reagan. Hello and welcome to the Al Jazeera Balkans. Gentlemen, thank you so much for taking time to speak to us.
Thank you so much for having me, Harun.
Yeah, now let me start by asking you, you as a Cold War historian, there were probably like a dozen political figures that you could have studied in both Europe and the US. Why did you choose Paula Nitzea?
Well, first of all, let me just say that these views are my own and not those of the US government and the State Department. To your question, I was at an event about 10 years ago where I was hearing a wonderful scholar named Frank Castigliola talk about George Kennan, who is perhaps one of the most famous US Cold War figures. And when he was talking about what Kennan thought or was writing in terms of the 1960s, the 1980s, I thought to myself, well, George Kennan is no longer in government and people aren't listening to him. And there's one person who is, and that's Paula Nitzea. He's there participating in US Cold War policies from the inception of the Cold War in 1946, 47, almost to the end of the Cold War in 1989 to 1991.
No, he had quite a colorful career. Take us back to the era of Paula Nitzea. He had visited Hiroshima back in 1945, I think, to assess the effects of strategic bombing. He was in office during the Berlin airlift. He had witnessed the Korean War conflict. What kind of a world was he witnessing? What kind of a man was he?
Well, he was a very smart, talented man, very confident, and somebody who very much believed in rationality in terms of making decisions. He loved to talk about logic chains, that if there was a problem, you could, apply logic to it and come up with a solution. And that's sometimes different than a politician who, has to appeal to the people to get elected. But Paula Nitzea thought that problems were solvable. To your question about the early Cold War period of 1946, 47, the Berlin airlift, et cetera, Paula Nitzea, who had worked on the strategic bombing survey in Germany and Japan, was very much convinced that the reason why Imperial Japan had attacked the United States in December 1939 was because the United States had let down its strength, that it had not devoted sufficient resources to military spending. And almost immediately at the end of World War II, after the end of it, in early 1946, he saw similar trends with respect to the Soviet Union, taking risks basically everywhere in the world, pressing its perceived advantages, and that he thought the United States, needed to rebuild its strength. And that was a theme that persisted throughout his career.
While you were writing this book and researching for it before that, did you have access to declassified files? Or did you mostly rely on interviews with people who had known him personally, or both?
Well, that's a wonderful question. Yeah, I spoke to a number of people who had known him. I think the two things I relied on most heavily, and one, there's a wonderful series of interviews with him at the Library of Congress here in Washington, D.C., interviews with the co-authors for his memoir that took place over about 8 or 9 years. And there's, 5,000 or 6,000 of pages of transcripts, which are really, really interesting. It took him a long time to finish his memoir. But then secondly, there's the project that I work on at the State Department, which is the Foreign Relations of the United States series. It's available, declassified documents available to everyone in the world at history.state.gov. And especially in the Foreign Relations, the FRUS series, are the volumes covering national security policy, which, involved Paula Nitzea quite heavily throughout the Cold War.
Now, what was Paula Nitzea's biggest lesson learned from World War II? What was his biggest takeaway?
Well, yes, as I think I said a minute ago, this notion that weakness, particularly U.S. military weakness, is provocative and encourages hostile countries to take risks. And, one thing that I think is not always well known is that almost immediately at the end of World War II, the United States demobilizes very quickly. And the aspiration on the part of President Harry Truman is to go back to a peacetime economy. Meanwhile, the Soviet Union, does not demobilize. And another thing that's not necessarily well known, because the discussions now about the U.S. U.S. budget and deficit spending is so astronomical, it's in the trillions. It's hard to kind of come to terms with the fact that in the late 1940s, a balanced budget on the part of the U.S. president was seen to be a moral imperative. And so both Harry Truman and then his successor, Dwight Eisenhower, wanted to present to Congress a balanced budget. And, Harry Truman had his own domestic priorities. He wanted to expand healthcare. And Paul Nitze's attitude was very strongly that the United States needed to ratchet up military spending.
Now, in your book, you devote a lot of attention to the now legendary top secret paper written in 1950 called the United States Objectives and Programs for National Security, or NSC 68. What did Paul Nitze aim to achieve by writing this paper? Some people will say that he wanted to scare President Truman into raising the military budget. Is this something you agree with?
In short, yes. He wanted to shock Truman into tripling the defense budget. But he also, and he worked with a team at the State Department to come up with NSC 68, the purpose of which was to think about a world in which hydrogen bombs, thermonuclear devices existed, and how would this affect, the international landscape. And it spends a lot of time articulating what Nitze and his colleagues perceived as Soviet threats and intentions. And it basically comes down to, we need to triple the defense budget. Now, the Secretary of Defense at the time, Louis Johnson, had promised Truman that he would keep defense spending, at around $12 or $13 billion. And as Nitze thought we needed to triple that and make clearer than truth what the threat was.
Right. Now we know that this paper was only classified later in the 1970s. I think it was 1975, if I'm not mistaken. So it was really a very narrow circle of people who had access to this paper. To what extent did it really impact their thinking and the way they perceived the Soviet Union back then?
Well, that's a very interesting question, and it's one I think that people really need to think about. And there was nothing particularly. It was top secret. It contained some references to nuclear weapons, but it's not like there was this paper that people in government had access to, and it was something that that nobody else that would have shocked anyone. It basically just came down to, here's the threat, we need to spend more money. And there were subsequent national security strategies on the part of Eisenhower and John F. Kennedy. The point about the 1970s, and I think the timing, is that people like Ronald Reagan, then the former governor who was challenging Gerald Ford for the Republican nomination in 1976, seized upon this document, especially in the wake of post-Vietnam, to say that the Democratic Party had once been very hawkish and very strong on the Soviet threat, and that it had abandoned its first principles. And so, Reagan appealed to that constituency and cited the declassification of NSC 68, which had always been kind of talked about, but I would say became, more important in retrospect from 1975 onward. Why did this document view every struggle around the world, from the communist insurgency in Malaya, to Korea, to Berlin, as sort of an underlying conflict between, communism and the free world? Well, I think another part of NSC 68 was that it took the principles in the American founding documents, the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution, and tried to sort of update them to the present reality of 1950, and also offer an explanation of what had been, according to Nitze and his co-authors, the underlying conflict that animated, what you could call the European Civil War from World War I, the interwar period of World War II, and said that, going forward, that is going to be the defining feature of the international landscape, is essentially a type of slavery versus a type of freedom. And, it wasn't kind of, in its articulation of freedom, it was very much relying upon U.S. traditions. And I think, to your point about how it affects the rest of the world, well, it also offered a prism for trying to understand the kind of post the sort of the collapse of European empires, the billion people in the world who were no longer going to be part of some type of European colonialism, and tried to kind of give a prism through which to address that population and make sure that they weren't attracted to the communist model, which after all had in some senses delivered. I mean, you had the Great Depression, which some people could say augured the collapse of the capitalist model. Through democratic means, it had brought into power people like Hitler. And then now, at the end of World War II, what is the most attractive model for modernization? And I think that Nitzea and others tried to, say full-throatedly that it has to be that of the American traditions.
Right. Now, somebody coming from Sarajevo, which was earlier part of Yugoslavia, I was wondering, when you went through these declassified documents, were there references from Paul Nitzea or other high-ranking national security officials to Yugoslavia, especially following the Stalin-Tito split in 1948? And how did they view? Yeah. Yeah,
there were certainly, and Philip Zelikow has written about this recently, that there was a kind of underappreciated period of in the early 1950s, where the United States really considered taking a stronger line in support of Tito to try to kind of pry apart the Soviet sphere. I have to say, I've not found Paul Nitzea particularly engaged with that topic. I mean, he really, his view remained, and to get back to NSC 68, I mean, just to connect the circle here, that Truman originally allowed the paper to sit in his desk. It took the June 1950 incursion by North Korea at the outbreak of the Korean War for him to take action. But I think that Nitzea, and this is something where I don't think it's been totally appreciated by people who have studied Nitzea, that from that period to the end of the Truman administrations, still believed that even with the nominal increases in the U.S. defense budget, that it had not taken the steps that it needed to rebuild its strength.
Yeah. Now, when you compare Nitzea to other high-ranking U.S. government officials, why was he so persistent about the U.S. securing, a preponderance of power in both nuclear and conventional terms? Why not opt for economic coercion or economic advantage or containment of the Soviet Union?
Well, I mean, he certainly, in terms of economic strength, he believed the United States was and would continue to be economically superior, and that the model worked. I mean, he had worked on Wall Street in the 1930s.
Exactly.
Yeah. I mean, he had no reservations
he
or
understood
concerns.
Economics quite well.
Well, he certainly believed he did. He had some. I would say he certainly understood it better than a lot of politicians who would offer things to people that did not necessarily pay off. But I think that he viewed the economic component as necessary but not sufficient. That you could devote a higher percentage of GDP to military defense. You could raise taxes. You could do all these things because the United States, essentially untouched by the horror of World War II, the American homeland is unscathed. You could do all these things, and the necessity of keeping military spending high was that it would deter other countries, most, in this case, the Soviet Union, from taking risks that would threaten anywhere in the world, threaten American interests and the values as articulated in NSC.
Right, but were there significant differences in their worldviews of Nitzea, of Secretary of Defense Louis Johnson, Secretary of State Dean Acheson, or George Kennan? I mean, where would you place Nitzea among these people?
Yeah, so I mean, I think that Louis Johnson was basically a non-entity. He just was an aspiring he was a former governor who wanted to succeed Harry Truman and would sort of do everything he could to position himself to do that. I think the key distinction here is between Nitzea and Kennan. Kennan wanted political containment and politically based containment, and he wanted it in those 4 or 5 essential spheres of power in the world, sort of specific regions and not necessarily global. Nitzea certainly thought that it was a global conflict and that, no area in the world could go unattended to. And I think that was basically, by 1950, he was more aligned with Dean Acheson than the Secretary of State. And, Kennan steps down as the Director of Policy Planning. Nitzea succeeds him. And I don't think after that, Kennan really has much impact on U.S. foreign policy making.
Right. But then, when the Vietnam War broke out, how did he view America's inability to prevail in Vietnam? Did it only strengthen his stance that the U.S. must allocate more, must invest more in its military might? Or
well, so here, this is a very interesting moment. So Nitzea, he is a Secretary of the Navy when the important decisions to escalate in Vietnam takes place. So he's not kind of at the front of the table with Secretary of Defense McNamara. And, this is not to excuse him because he's kind of wishy-washy on it. He tries to say to McNamara at one point when he becomes the deputy that he really doesn't think that the fight is worth it. And then McNamara says, well, what if the communists press us elsewhere? Can you guarantee that won't, hurt us? And Nitzea says, no, I can't. So Nitzea's no great hero on Vietnam. He's no great Cassandra. I think the most important point I would say here is that for him, looking backward and sometimes in the moment, that the key decision that is mistaken on the part of U.S. foreign policymakers, and McNamara in particular, is in the aftermath of the Cuban Missile Crisis. That from McNamara's perspective, both sides, the U.S. and the Soviets, had come to the brink of nuclear annihilation, and they had decided to step back, and they would realize after that moment in October 1962 that they could never do this again. And from McNamara's perspective, that means, we could cap in this case, the U.S. Minuteman program at 1,000 missiles, because it didn't really matter whether you had strategic superiority. And Nitzea took quite the opposite approach. He thought that the lesson of the Cuban Missile Crisis was that the Soviets had backed down in the face of U.S. Nuclear and conventional superiority, and then the lesson from that should be that you needed to sustain that superiority. So the kind of broader lesson of the Vietnam debacle, I think from Nitzea's perspective, was that it had allowed the Soviets by the end of the 1960s to catch up and in some instances, in some cases, surpass the U.S. in terms of nuclear capabilities.
Right. Now, it seems to me that whatever job was given to Nitzea, he performed it quite well, And here I wanted to ask you, when President Reagan appointed him his arms control negotiator in 1980s, and during those talks in Geneva in 1982 with Yuli Kwitsinski, in their famous walk in the woods, they came up with quite a comprehensive plan to eliminate intermediate range missiles. Why was this plan rejected by both President Reagan and President Brezhnev?
Well, this is such an interesting moment from my perspective, and for a couple of reasons. One, Nitzea went beyond his instructions. He, had the courage to risk being fired, and I think that in some instances, for diplomats of any country, it's worth doing that and being willing to face the consequences. When the plan comes back to the Reagan administration, they actually consider it. It's not rejected out of hand. But then a couple of days later, the Soviets preemptively announced that they have rejected this plan. And, why it is they rejected that, I've never quite understood. I've been reading Sergei Radchenko's wonderful book about the broad history of Soviet foreign policy making. And, I can only kind of discern from that Leonid Brezhnev was basically such a non-entity at that point that, there was a kind of an inertia on the part of maybe Andrei Gromyko to just reject it out of hand. But I would say that it was probably a mistake for, look, given what Soviet intentions were, which is to try to prevent the deployment of U.S. And NATO deployment of INF systems in the fall of 1983, it probably would have been shrewder on their part not to preemptively reject it.
Mm-hmm. Now, when you look back at his life from today's perspective, I mean, given his extensive knowledge and his service to the state, why did he never really enjoy that public fame that George Kennan or Henry Kissinger enjoyed? I mean, why was he, not to say that he was forgotten, but he certainly wasn't as popular as Henry Kissinger.
Yeah, I make the comparisons with Kissinger a couple times throughout the book. Mm-hmm. They had a kind of frenemyship going back to the mid-1950s. And Kissinger had a real sense of humor that was able to project it in certain settings that I don't think Nitzea was able to do. I'm not saying Nitzea wasn't funny. He just wasn't as funny as Kissinger. He also was not willing to, flatter or kiss up to policymakers in the same way that Kissinger was, especially with Nitzea. And I'll give you a clear example of kind of Nitzea's inability to do so. He had been the Deputy Secretary of Defense through the end of 1968, and 8 years later, when Jimmy Carter is running for president in 1976, he assembles a national security team based on figures who have had high position in the Democratic Party administrations, and they have a meeting in Georgia, and Nitzea's there as a potential Secretary of Defense for Jimmy Carter, and the meeting goes terribly. You can read the transcripts, just how unwilling Nitzea is to say anything that is nice or flattering to Jimmy Carter. And you can kind of go from that moment in the summer of 1976 to January of 1977. Nearly everybody else who was in the room with Carter in Georgia is a part of the administration, except for Paul Nitzea. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
And finally, George Kennan was sort of a point of reference in all these debates following Russia's invasion and annexation of Crimea back in 2014, when some analysts diagnosed a return to the Cold War. And I was wondering, and there was an article published in Foreign Policy just recently, are we witnessing a return to those 1950s Paul Nitzea thinking where military dominance is a top priority?
Well, we are certainly in a type of Cold War. It's, I think, more complicated on the nuclear front than the Cold War, and that you have with the United States, Russia, and the People's Republic of China, the potential of three pure nuclear competitors, and it's extremely difficult. I mean, if bilateral superpower nuclear arms negotiations were complicated enough during the Cold War, I think trilateral agreements will be even harder. I think that, to your direct question about military dominance, there certainly has been, I would say from 2014 to the present moment, a much more of an emphasis on, each side wanting to deter, and then, trying to figure out what is the boundary between deter and provoke. This is obviously exceedingly difficult. I do think that one of the encouraging things as compared to the present moment and potential crises, mini crises on the horizon, is that you do have the experience of the Cold War, of moments to look back upon and potentially draw some productive lessons from. And so, for instance, after the Cuban Missile Crisis, in which it's very important to note there's no direct line of communication between Washington and Moscow, that you do have the establishment of the so-called hotline between Washington and Moscow. And then in the mid-1980s, some of the agreements that Paul Nitzea is working on, you have the establishment of the Nuclear Risk Reduction Center. And so there are at least now, lines of communication set up and lessons that can be drawn from the Cold War to apply to the present day.
Right. James Graham Wilson, it was such a pleasure speaking to you. Thank you so much once again for your time.
Thank you so much.
Always trust.
We ask the questions.
What is needed in the world?
Is that going to be?